All right, well, thank you all for having me. My name is Becky OSullivan. I'm an archaeologist, and I work for the Florida Public Archaeology Network. Our office is at USF in Tampa. So thank you for having me, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the archaeology of two really special places in Sarasota County, Little Salt Spring and Warm Mineral Springs. Next slide, please. So, these spring sites, they're treasures that we enjoy today, but they're also these really wonderful windows into the past. So I'm going to do a deep dive into 12,000 years of history in about 5 minutes. But first, who here has ever been to a spring in Florida? Most of us, right? Who here has ever been to Warm Mineral Springs? Who here has ever been to Little Salt Spring? A few people, right? And that makes sense. Warm Mineral Springs is open to the public. It's owned by the city of Northport. It's a really great recreation place. Little Salt Spring, on the other hand, is closed to the public. It's privately owned by the University of Miami, and it's a place of research. But they're both located in Northport, as you can see here. Little Salt is more to the north, and Warm Mineral is just to the south there. Next slide, please. So the way we're going to take that deep dive is through the magical powers of Photoshop. I've got some different views through time, and what I'm going to talk about is how past sea level rise affected the way that native peoples used Little Salt Spring through time. And those changes really affected the spring and how it looked and how people could interact with it. So here you can see it today. The trailers and everything that are to the left, that's some of the research trailers. That's Price Boulevard, that's up in the top corner. Next slide, please. If you go back 5,000 years, obviously there's not, trailers that were there 5,000 years ago. The road wasn't there. At this time, people were moving around seasonally, and the spring would have been an important place to stop and get some water. And also, there could be some village sites. We've got modern sea levels. People are also taking advantage of our estuaries, right? So we have a lot of Native American sites that are in the coastal areas. Next slide, please. If we go back further, 7,000 years ago, Little Salt Spring was a burial place. This is a community burial ground. The layers of peat that were along the shore of the spring were places where Native peoples would come from different parts of the state to bury their dead. We see this tradition at this time of people from all the way to the St. Johns River and then across the state in a band to Sarasota County who were coming to bury their dead in these wetland areas and in these springs. Next slide, please. If we go back a little farther, about 8,500 years ago to the early Archaic period, this was a time when sea levels were really changing, right? They were rising as the sea level rise was happening. That's putting pressure on our groundwater and pushing that water up in the springs. We like to talk about this time as a time of innovation, right? Native peoples they're not just innovating and creating new technologies, they're also creating new social technologies and ways of living together, staying in one place more of the time. And spring sites are great places to find evidence of that. Next slide. Going back further, 10,000 years ago, we were at that kind of Pleistocene-Holocene changeover. We like to call it the Paleo-Indian period. So the water was even lower. Below the basin, you can see that dry basin there. People were nomadic, moving around. So these springs were real touchstones that people could come to meet one another and then also get the things that they needed. Next slide. And then the earliest evidence we have at Little Salt, 12,000 years ago, the water was 40 meters below where it is today. And at that 40-meter level, there was a little ledge. We actually find evidence of those paleo people rappelling down into the spring to get fresh water, but also to snag animals that had fallen into the spring and cook them up and have a barbecue on the ledge there, which is pretty cool. Next slide. So the wonderful thing about springs, besides the obvious ecological factors, is springs are great for their preservation. Those layers of peat that develop, that anaerobic environment preserves artifacts like the one you see the person holding there that are 12,000 plus years old, made of wood. Next slide. This brings our oases for plants, but also for people. Next slide. And springs are also places of community. Warm Mineral Springs is a place of community today. Little Salt Spring was a place of community 12,000 years ago that people came together. Next slide. So, Native peoples are able to innovate and to change with the sea level rise, and hopefully archaeologists of the future will look back on us and see us as innovators and people who are able to change that social technology as well. Thank you.